I'd like to have a little theoretical introduction to the idea of blending two versions where one is much darker than the other, blending them credibly using a blurred layer mask. This is sort of an introduction to Chapter 11. I'm going to be using as an example the Hawaiian picture that is found in Figure 11.4 through 11.6 and talk about what's necessary to get it into proper form. I want to say at the outset this is not really the right way to do it. That's discussed in Chapter 12. This is this picture that we're working on is a pretty bad one. Hopefully you would not have to work on something this bad. And when it isn't quite this bad, the technique that I'm showing is not really going to be the right one. But this is just to get us into the frame of mind of how to merge two halves of an image into one. Okay, so let me now open this image up and we'll see what's wrong with it. Doesn't take much examination. We have some shrubbery in the foreground, which is a little bit too dark, but basically okay. The background is very interesting, but it's washed out as anything. So there are a number of ways where we could get a better background, and here's one of the simpler ones. I'm just going to make a multiply layer, and that isn't quite enough, so I'll make another multiply layer on top of that, and even a third. Now, for convenience's sake, let me merge with Shift-Command-E those three multiplying layers into one. And now we have our two layers ready to merge. Here's the original, where we have decent foreground and terrible background. Here we have a really nice background, but unfortunately the foreground has completely plugged up. So what we would like to do is somehow merge these two, where we get this foreground, but this background, and doing that and convincing the viewer that it's really one uniform picture is not that easy. I mean, you could try doing something like this with a blend if, but as you can see, this is somewhat promising, but it has certain flaws that would have to be dealt with. The better way to do it is with a layer mask, but what should that layer mask look like? It wants to be light in the background because it would like to have the top layer show through there. It wants to be dark in the foreground because it wants to block this part of the layer and use this layer underneath instead. Now, how do we find such a thing? The easiest way is to load one of the channels as a layer mask. There are other ways that we can do it, but I'm saying this is the easiest. Now, what are the channels? It's easy to say red, green, and blue, but that's not true. There's a fourth channel floating around, which is the RGB composite. A grayscale version of the RGB is also a possibility. Plus, we have four more possibilities because we have two different layers, and the two layers each are very different in darkness. The bottom layer is much lighter, the top layer is much darker. So the four channels on each layer would have greatly different results. We therefore have 8 possibilities, even before we start thinking about, esoteric things like making a copy, taking it into some other color space, and using that as a layer mask. All right, what layer mask should we use? Well, there is a right answer. If you don't know that answer offhand, then you might have to look at all of these possible channels. Like, for example, should it be the red channel on the bottom layer? Well, that's the bottom layer red, and that's the top layer red. Okay, which one would it be better? It's hard to say, because the bottom layer red is nice and light in the background, which is what we want, whereas the top layer red might block out some of the nice background that we have. But then again, the bottom layer red might permit this, this area of shrubbery to plug up too much. Now, do we really want to go through all 8 comparisons to find out which one the best is? I hope not. It would be a big waste of time. By default, I would say you want to take the RGB composite. That's the one that's most likely to be correct, sight unseen. Probably from the bottom layer, because I would think you want more of the good background than a good foreground. So that would be the guess by somebody who doesn't know their channel structure very well. But the really right answer would be to ask yourself, what is it that we want here? We want something that's dark in the trees in the foreground, but light in the background. In The top layer, it probably won't make very much difference which channel we use if we use a channel from the top layer, because they're all very dark in the foreground and they're probably not all that different in the background. If we use the bottom layer, though, as a source for the mask, that's going to be different. They're all going to be fairly light in the foreground, which is what we want, but one would be the darkest in the background. How do we know which one that is? Well, the foreground here is green, natural green, and we ask ourselves what channel is always the darkest in natural greens? Answer being the blue. Okay. The red is fairly dark in the greens, but the blue is much darker. So the blue would be our choice here. So go back up here, activate the layer mask. Notice I just activated by clicking on it, and we see a border around it. So that is now the target for apply image. And we call up apply image, and we say, okay, which layer is it coming from? The background layer, not the merged. And we're going to say we would like to use, in normal mode, the blue channel. And you can see right away that we're getting a better result with the blue than we would with the RGB. Okay, so that's the blue now loaded as a layer mask. How are we doing? Here's before, here's after. That's getting close to being a credible merge, but it doesn't quite work. It looks like there's some lack of contrast somewhere. And here's where we're going to have to make a big blur of this layer mask to make it more believable. The rule here is, if the two layers are very different in terms of their darkness, then you have to blur the layer mask. And that's clearly the case here. We have one layer, here I'm going to toggle this off for a second by shift clicking on it. That layer is clearly much darker than this one. Therefore, this layer mask here must be blurred. So that might be a typical size, something in the 30s or the 40s for the blur radius. And let's see what blurring the layer mask did. There's before the blur, there's after. And you see how it seems to have sharpened the picture? Isn't that weird that a blur would do that? But that's how it works. That's how you get a better looking merge between the two halves. And this, I think, is very difficult to detect that there's anything going on. Let's just take a look at what happened to that mask here. Before the blur, the mask looked like this, a copy of the blue channel. But after the blur, it looked like that. This seems crazy. Why would this mask work? Well, it works pretty well because it's blocking out a sort of vague outline of the dark area, and it's allowing the darker background to show through. Where you're really seeing it work is like right in here. See, this is really part of the light area that we don't really want that to darken very much, because we want to have it different from the shrubbery. So we don't want this area to get as dark as rapidly as this area here, where we want the whole background to look good. So to make that occur, we do the blur. So now that little hole in the shrubbery is going to be blocked. It no longer exists. Impact. Before we do that blur, this part here darkens just as much as the background does. But when we do the blur, this is going to become much lighter, and it's going to be more obvious that there is sort of this hole in the shrubbery, like that. Okay. So this is why it's important to know which layer mask to use in the first place, and in the second place, how you have to blur these things in order to make them work as layer merge. Okay, let me show you one more time. Here's before, here's after. And so this technique has transformed something that's really bad into something that I think is pretty good. Food for thought.